transformed, was received in our Constitution as a constitutional fundamental value, and more than this, as a binding legal concept and norm, both as a principle and as a rule. Yeah? And then a little bit about what's the most important concern and challenge for our courts, and even for our literature, who is dealing rightly about fundamental rights and human dignity, the connection, how we understand or misunderstand the connection between human dignity and human and fundamental rights. And here we have in Brazil, we're not kind of Brazilian exceptionalism, but quite something like a Brazilian exceptionalism. And so I think this would be maybe something interesting even for a philosopher or expert in social science like Emil, who I'm also seeing here at this conference. Well, having said this, it's okay. Not so bad. Okay. Having said this, of course, I won't here tell you about the history of the idea of human dignity in philosophy, of course, major, of course, in the history of Occidental thought. But I can say, and that maybe it's important, that our Constitution from 1988 was the first including human dignity, not with this terminology, but the dignity of the human person. So that's something very meaningful that we used, not as in Germany, human dignity, but here we use dignity of the human person. Obviously, it can be understood and applied in the same way, but it's not only a coincidence. We have a reason for this option. But it's also true that in Brazil, we were one of the first countries including human dignity to a certain extent in a constitutional text. Because it's also something important to take into account that human dignity, though being a much older idea and concept, was only included in the constitutional grammar, the constitutional constitutions, very late. In few constitutions before Second World War, but the majority of constitutions start to include human dignity as a constitutional principle or even right, also only after Second World War, and in a very slow process. Germany was one of the first, Italy, but Germany stronger, the stronger meaning, the human dignity constitution. But Brazil was one of the first, because the first one was the Weimar Constitution from 1919, and in Brazil we copied exactly the same term from the Weimar Constitution, that the social economic order should has the objective, has the goal to assure life according to the minimum of existence. And this is, of course, life with dignity. There's, of course, a mere programmatic approach, like Weimar Constitution, not binding, but not considered a binding norm, though in the part, not in the preamble, but in the social part of the social order. And this remains in our Constitution today. So it belongs to our constitutional history tradition since 1934. And one of the 4 or 5 constitutions before World War II, including in some way human dignity in the constitutional text. Now, of course, the shift was, the great change was including human dignity, as in German and other constitutions, in the first part, the part of the fundamental principles of the Constitution, Article 1. Differently than in Germany, in our Constitution, human dignity is not the only value and ground basic of our democratic and social state. How democratic, now how republican, we can discuss deeply, but at least in a formal way, as such, recognized in our Constitution. That's important because it's difficult to establish here a hierarchy between these values and principles, because the formal way, as constitutional law, they are exact, have the same rank, I'm not talking about the value as such, but as a constitutional binding norm, along with democracy, sovereignty, the social value of work, labor, the freedom of economic freedom. All these values are in the same article at the beginning of our constitutional text. This is very meaningful and also shows that our Constitution has not adopted a specific philosophical or historical philosophical tradition in terms of human dignity. It's an open concept, and we can see that in the constitutional text and in the way the human dignity clause has been applied and interpreted by courts and in the literature is in fact very open, and it connects different traditions in the way human dignity is understood in our Constitution. And that's also important. It's not a liberal way to understand it, also liberal way, but also a social way. And I think showing some examples from our Supreme Court decision, we can understand this a little bit better. So in terms of the normative value of human dignity in our Constitution, now as constitutional law, human dignity is considered in Brazil, also differently in other places, both a principle, value, constitutional value, a constitutional principle, and even it can be, it can appear, even expressed in the Constitution as a rule. A rule that concretizes, that determines certain aspects, to protect certain aspects or manifestations of the value as a whole. That's also important because this is connected to another very important subject that is, and very discussed today, strongly discussed today, if human dignity is an absolute value principle, all right, or not. This double position as a principle and as a rule has been very important for this discussion, even for the practice, because in constitutional law we disconnect now the view of the positive constitutional law from the value, because the principle is to a certain extent the bridge between philosophy, ethics, and the domain of the values, and of course the domain of the law. That's the current and dominant opinion in Brazil related to constitutional law and the law at all. I think this is the first part to explain how this was inserted in our current actual constitution. The second point is, and this is also very important and very polemic, controversial, and I heard it was very, it's pity that I have not been here tomorrow, that it was discussed this morning, the relation from human dignity with human rights and fundamental rights. And of course, I was very quick, but it's also very important, the idea is, and our Constitution was very clear in this option, fundamental rights are not always human rights. Fundamental rights are often also human rights. And of course, we must also distinguish here between human rights as moral rights or whatever can be the justification and fundamentation of the concept of human rights. I'm not able to go deeper into this point, of course, but very important is that fundamental rights in our current constitution, and of course it's not an answer that all constitutions in the world adopted, more or less. Of course, this is the tradition that became stronger with the German constitution, German influence in the constitution, Occidental constitutionalism, this concept of fundamental rights, as rights that are strictly rights that are protected as an option of each constitution, of constitutional the constitutional framers of the constitution. But it's a historical option. What the majority of the people decided to protect, which values, to what extent these values should be protected, and to what extent, and they should be protected as law, as rights, as legal entitlements. That's the problem. And of course, the discussion is not every fundamental right must be to be a fundamental right and human right. Of course, these are not there's not an opposite, not an opposition between these two concepts, but it can be. It can be. Of course, we can have human rights. They are not previewed and protected in a certain constitution. This can happen. It's rare today because, in general, democratic, also self-called democratic constitutions won't be away from the international protection of human rights. So they include these rights, at least the majority of these rights in the constitution, but not necessary. So the argument that human dignity is the ground, the basis of all fundamental rights, it's wrong. As law, constitutional law. As constitutional law. I'm not saying it's human rights. I'm saying it's human rights. I'm not to be misunderstood. And these are complementary perspectives. They can fit completely together. And of course, we have fundamental rights. They are fundamental, but not human rights. I can give an example. And they are not human rights independently of which justification we can imagine. The right, the mandado de injunção. We have a kind of injunction, constitutional injunction, for to face and to allow the protection of a right, if not being regulated by the legislator, by the lack of legislation. So that's a remedy, constitutional remedy. The status of fundamental rights, directly binding law. It not depends from legal regulation. So it's full fundamental right our constitution, but it's obviously not a human right. Let's say that it's injunction, that is constitutional remedy, which is a fundamental right in Brazil. So from a formal point of view, and the material specific from the constitution, it's not a human right. It's not even in any international covenant of human rights, and of course we can't say here that's a moral minimum morale international or a moral consent, whatever is or a moral claim, which is impossible to say this. So we have it as a fundamental right, and this, the human dignity, is not the base of this fundamental right. Even then, it's a fundamental right. The same protection that fundamental, they are human rights, the legal protection, of course. What's the difference? Of course, these fundamental rights, even other fundamental rights, are instrumental in many cases to protect fundamental rights. They are also human rights, as well. This is the difference. And it's an important difference because it also matters when it comes to limiting rights. And of course, when you are facing limitations of rights and the process of balancing when rights clashing, are colliding, and must be, of course, it must be solved by judges, if you like or not. It must be solved. There are cases that come to court. They must be solved. Of course, we have the process of balancing. We can call it, as we as we wish. The problem of balance, use the most usual term in English. And then, of course, we can evaluate the weight of each right in conflict and the value who is behind this right to solve the concrete case. That's the approach. But often, with other problems related, that is how and to what extent judges can and should decide about this. But on the perspective, we must decide. We must decide. And sometimes I would prefer not to decide, but in general we must decide. Having said this, so we have this approach. It is not the basis of all fundamental rights. That's in our constitutional law. The third question here is how human dignity can relate, can interact with fundamental rights and human rights. What are the ways in this principle are being applied to rights? So we have here also distinguishing between human dignity as a fundamental principle in an objective way, an objective norm. Here human dignity as everywhere, for better or worse, are being applied as a kind of legitimacy, as a value that is the ground, the base for the legitimacy of the constitutional order or legal order, and for the rights, and demands an interpretation from every law according to this principle, very broad and very dangerous. And I can give here some examples to finish my short, too long conference. Let's say when I must finish. That's one way to apply human dignity as a guiding principle, material criteria to interpret other rights. I will give an example. The equal protection clause and the interdiction of any kind of discrimination. So the shifting the transition from a mere formal way to understand and apply the equality, the right to equality, to a material way to apply the right to equality is related to a view of the equality based on human dignity. Not only people must be equal before the law, but inequalities, they correspond as a violation of human dignity, must have a special treatment and restrict much more the possibility of the legislator to consider here differences, to treat people in a different way. So the special clause of prohibited discrimination are a way, to read and apply equal protection according to this material criteria of human dignity, for instance. The way in the US Supreme Court, strange, the US Supreme Court say, and they don't have a right human dignity clause in the Constitution, say, just not going for another legal order, to apply the death penalty is not against the Constitution. So we know this even being said. But what did the Supreme Court do? They interpret the death penalty prohibition or according to human dignity, saying when the death penalty is applied in a inhuman and degrading and cruel way, then it's unconstitutional. In certain situations, apply the death penalty is against human dignity. In certain, the way you apply the death penalty by hanging was the last step, by shooting, and now they're discussing the lethal injection. Is the current discussion in the Supreme Court, going for a judgment, is a way to humanize the death penalty, or the limit death penalty. And so that's the way other clauses are read in according to human dignity in Brazil as well. A second way is human dignity as justification, as a material criteria to recognize other rights, non-enumerated rights in our Constitution, or to justify the fundamentality of rights that are not in the chapter of fundamental rights, but located in other parts of the Constitution. So this is not according to this express decision of our Constitution, of Constitution, a fundamental right. But you can say, of course, this is a right that's not written in the chapter of fundamental rights, but even then, because of its strong connection, as a strong requirement of human dignity, it is a fundamental right. This is a way to justify that other expressive rights because are also fundamental rights and with the same protection. And in other ways, the thoughts is not his rights not written in the Constitution, but it's a fundamental central dimension of human dignity. So we should recognize it, if not written in the Constitution, as a fundamental right, as a implicit fundamental right. So we have many decisions in this sense. It relates to other principles like equality, the homo-partnerschaft, the equal position of Entidade familiar, Lebenspartnerschaft, Deutschland. No, the position of homo-partnerschaften, I don't understand what I'm saying, same-sex marriage, and so on. The adoption from children by homosexual, for instance. This is a clause, what according to the express text of our Constitution, say marriage only between woman and man. And trying to say that's not the limit. You can go beyond this. You will say, okay, according to the provision of non-discrimination, and here applying, right or not, the theory of recognition from Axel Honneth, it must be recognized in our society as being part equally and deserve the same respect and consideration in our society. So in this case, the Supreme Court said that's a non-merited right from these people. The protection must be the same. And one of the reasons was human dignity, reading non-discrimination provision according to human dignity, and according to the theory of human dignity as recognition in the social dimension. So the way the court is writing, this is, can be of course disputed, but it's an interesting example also in other legal orders. So that's another way to use and apply human dignity. The right to name certain specific personality rights that are not written in the Constitution. The general clause of personality, they are not included in our Constitution, as in Germany, are also recognized based on human dignity. And the last part is that human dignity is also a criterion to limit the limitations of fundamental rights, in one sense. In another sense, to justify limitation of fundamental rights. So it's also a limit of rights, and as you say in Germany, a limit of limiting fundamental rights. Why? Since rights, fundamental rights are not absolute rights. Fundamental rights, I'm not saying it's now human dignity. Fundamental are not absolute rights. Of course, you need criteria to justify a limitation of fundamental rights. That is usually the protection of other rights or constitutional values. That's basic. And here, human dignity is a kind of last branch, Haltebefehl, stop order. Here we must stop. Here the limitation must really stop, because here begins the protection of the core of the fundamental rights and its core in human dignity. That's one way human dignity is interpreted here in other jurisdictions. The problem is, what is human dignity and what is the core in human dignity of this right? And then that's why the majority of the literature say the core of a fundamental right is not always his core in human dignity, because not every fundamental right is a human right. Not every fundamental right is a human right, but even then it has an essential core that can't be abolished by the legislator. So that's important usage of human dignity. But with this, I come to the last part, that's discussion about human dignity being an absolute or relative value, principle, or right. A big issue. There are many books and articles written about this. In Germany, we can even lose the perspective of what so many things are written about this. But in Brazil, it's also disputed, but the majority tends to admit that since human dignity in the law, is expressed as a principle, general principle, and as a strict rule, and this is the Robert Alexis approach, but of course you must follow this approach exactly, but it's not a problem. Why I'm saying this? But of course we have strict rules in our constitution prohibiting many actions that are clearly violations of human dignity in international law, and even if you consider human rights as moral claims. The prohibition of torture and inhuman and degrading treatment. That's not the principle in the Constitution, that's a rule. You can't submit someone to torture and to inhuman and degrading treatment. That's not the principle. The principle, of course, is behind this. The principle is the basis of this legal rule. That's the majority. That's a legal rule. And here, balance is not admitted as such. You can't, of course, reduce someone to the slavery, as the punishment of a slave. You can't impose cruel and unusual punishment, like in the US. These all are constitutional rules and at the same fundamental rights that protects specific dimensions of human dignity, and that are really, in this sense, absolute, not being submitted to balancing. But, that's right in the last edition of my book, even then not absolute. The absolute is relative. Why it can be relative, and it is to a certain extent relative, but no one knows exactly what is torture. Okay, one can say that you have a common sense that to submit someone waterboarding is torture. But to sit here in an afternoon in front of an office, here in this conference, may be torture for some people. But say this, of course, who must define what is torture or inhuman and degrading treatment in order to be possible for a judge to say, okay, this is torture, here you must have a penalty, criminal penalty. This is not torture. This is inhuman treatment. Okay, someone must decide this. And of course, this is a dynamic concept. Even what is torture, and what is privacy, what is intimacy, is and such, even being a rule, this rule must be applied. And to apply this rule in law, you must have a definition, Tatbestand, and so forth. Then the absolute is relative in this sense. Because if you decide this is not a violation of human dignity, this is not a violation of this human right, so we are excluding this from the protection. Before it's even applied, we exclude this from the protection. And if not being balanced in the traditional way, it's also a way to limit what is human dignity for its protection. So that's a very big challenge. Our Supreme Court tends to say human dignity is a real and absolute barrier, but sometimes without explaining, saying any word about what they consider as human dignity. The minimum of existence, existence minimum, is being considered the core of social rights, if not being the core of all social rights. Okay, then they say, okay, if every case the minimum of existence is being violated, then you must recognize subject right to social benefits, right to health, access to education. And any argument can be opposed to this subjective right, because we think it's absolute. But in many decisions, they don't really show what is understood, even as an existential minimum of existence. And that's a problem, because you can put everything under human dignity clause and nothing. And if the tendency is having more decisions going a little bit deeper in the argument of human dignity, in general, courts are still using this clause in a very arbitrary way. Sometimes, of course, with good results that can be sustained, even with or without human dignity. And of course, in Brazil, there is a tendency, still there is a methodological, in terms of methodology of application. So you should really go to an open clause if you have specific rights, principal rules protecting certain aspects of human dignity, of human rights. And only if you don't have an answer in the tradition of dogmatics and precedents to apply. In this case, of course, you must go to human dignity to inform the interpretation. This should be the way. But since you are abandoning, and that's maybe a problem, excuse me to say this, the problem of our law and of our judicial activism is not philosophy, it's the lack of dogmatics. The lack of dogmatics is the problem of law and how law behaves with philosophical concepts, doing everything with them. So dogmatics is something law needs to be applied in a at least safer way and with some equality. So we need dogmatics, and even the dogmatics, so that we can't use philosophical argument. I'm not saying this, but we need the legal dogmatics to apply principles in law. If they're connected deeply with, of course, philosophical reasoning and so on, ethical reasoning, whatever. So this is the problem we are facing now, and courts must be solved, this, but I don't think they want really, in general, solve this. Because not solving this, they keep, especially superior courts, keep a little bit the power to impose personal, not always shared, justifications for certain results in applying human dignity in practical cases, and of course to solve real conflicts between private persons and even against with public actors. So, sorry for being made it too long, sorry for my really broken English. I might think it was enough to be understood. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ingo, for this great, thought-provoking talk. Now the floor is open, so anyone would like to raise questions or offer some comments to Professor Sarlet's presentation, please feel free to do so.
There's not a way to say you are not
Luigi.
Philosophers.
I think I can talk without microphone. I would like to go back to the point you were making about the value of human dignity within the Brazilian Constitution with regard to the other values that are also recognized, if I understood correctly, in the same article.
Yes.
Okay? And also to the point that you made about the limiting function that human dignity seems to be playing. I didn't understand this, whether it's the limiting of the limit.
It's a German. It's a German.
Okay. Anyway, can you explain a little bit better in what ways human dignity plays this limiting function for the other values? That's the first question. The second one is whether, in virtue of this limiting function, you would be ready to say that human dignity is the most important value that shapes all the others in the Brazilian Constitution.
Yes, very good question. Thank you. It allows me to go a little bit beyond what I was saying before. First, I said, and that's true, that the formal rank as a legal binding norm is the same for all these values. The formal rank. But of course, in a substantive approach, human dignity plays a major role when used to solve specific conflicts, going directly to the other question, between other rights or even between rights and other constitutional rights. Because these conflicts, these collisions to solve to the judge or even to the legislator, they also balance rights, and it's the first option that the legislator should be this, should do this. The judge comes after and say, okay, this was not the best balance, not the best choice. This choice is against human dignity. Saying this, I would say, of course, in a substantive way, human dignity plays a major role as a value as a material criteria for this balancing. What I say, we have, but not only human dignity is a justification for limiting other rights. We have other rights. Each fundamental right can be a paradigm for limiting other rights, constitutional values as such. Because the dominant is that I can always, in general of course, I will see the concrete case if it's legitimate or not, restrict a right only if I'm promoting the protection of another right or constitutional value.
Right.
Maybe environment, or not.
No, I understand the contrast of rights. I'm
Yes.
sure that one limits the other.
But was it the case? Of course, example. I would be a very actual example. I was talking this morning at the Judge Academy. The traditional conflict between freedom of expression and information and human dignity. That's the case. Human dignity is used as a ground justification to limit human freedom of speech. Maybe hate speech, degrading speech, racism, considered in any legal order as violations of human dignity, in general, is material, is the way to use human dignity in some specific dimensions as a limit to other fundamental rights. They are also based on human dignity, liberty, human expression. So that's a kind of dialogical, even dynamic and dialectic way that human dignity is used on both sides. But you can't limit the freedom of speech in the way to violate human dignity on the other side. And that's a difficulty for the judge. And of course, that's an example, current example, right to be forgotten. That's now the mode, right to be forgotten. If you recognize the right to be forgotten, you are recognizing that certain aspects relate to your honor, your image, your dignity, your intimacy, so your personal identity can't be shown or can't be exposed forever in the internet. So you need new instruments, but the subject is not new. But the values they are really at stake are not new. But we need new instruments if you really want to give at least some protection to human dignity in this new, in the digital era, for instance. That's maybe a good example. And also an example how it's difficult to give. Of course, then we have different legal orders. US, the preferred position, clear preferred position of freedom of expression. So here human dignity is, of course, considered very strongly in its condition as autonomy, based on autonomy. Much more than here. But here our Supreme Court are also sustaining nowadays a preferred position of freedom of speech. So we don't know exactly what will be with hate speech, because we have a former decision from 15 years ago saying that the denial of the Holocaust is hate speech. And it's even criminally, it's a criminal crime. But now we have a preferred position, and the Supreme Court says only fake news are interdicted, not humor. So what will the court say now if we must decide again about hate speech? Will it fit to its former decision that the denial of the Holocaust is hate speech or not? But it's open. But maybe I can give you an example. And of course, here human dignity plays a role as a value. the substantive way, of course, it has a preferred position by, I say the formal way, as a legal binding norm, but if related with other fundamental, it has a preferred position in the Constitution.
Okay, Alessandro?
I will try also to.
And Albert.
Thank you for your presentation. I have a question. At the end of the talk, you lamented that the problem with Brazilian law is the lack of dogmatism, of dogmatic. How do you reconcile these with using dignity as a principle? Because dignity is quite a wide principle, so it's not clearly defined. It's not the case that you can immediately say, oh, okay, this is human dignity. So how do you, don't you think that precisely the appeal to dignity may be a kind of lack of dogmatism?
I will try to explain. Even very broad principles, conceitos jurídicos determinados, we have not only dignity, we have social value of property, we have intimacy, we have liberty, we have privacy. Of course, we have lots of open clauses. Even torture is relatively open. Of course, human dignity is maybe the broadest. But what I mean with dogmatics here, and it's useful here, is to consider, for instance, the methodology of application. To go first to the rule, to go first for a tradition. Because, of course, we have a tradition in which concerns what violates human dignity. Of course, there are certain dogmas, certain criteria that are established. They are established in international law, even in the constitutional tradition of many countries, even in Brazil. So dogmatics, of course, to consider all the tradition, to consider the different arguments that are being constantly used as a criteria. So argumentation based on certain criteria, legal criteria, and even moral criteria, can be also a strong instrumentary to particularly in the dogmatic way. I mean in this, you have standards, you have a tradition, you have precedent saying this is the way to resolve human dignity. If you want to create another one, you must justify this concrete case. So not also, okay, human dignity is what I, as a Supreme Court judge, say now. Tomorrow I think I have slept badly, I have eaten something, rotten fish, here an oyster, here for an opposite, no, we'll decide the opposite. This is the lack of dogmatics. I can't explain Spanish in Portuguese.
Alberto.
Yes, very quickly, my point actually was related to the one raised by Luigi, and the point is again about dignity as the limit of a limitation of fundamental right. Well, if I may rephrase my point by saying, by recalling your definition, you started by saying, okay, human dignity is a value, then is a principle, and then is also a right. You ended your presentation, your talk, by saying, okay, perhaps we have to admit that human dignity, in a sense, is a sort of meta something. So is a meta right. So is a principle of self-limitation of other fundamental. Then my question is, well, are you sustaining that human dignity is a sort of meta value, then of a meta principle, and then of a meta right? And if so, are you sure that this could be considered as valid per se by setting apart, starting from your being a judge, by setting apart concrete and constitutional constraints that are related to specific histories, to specific historical part of concrete countries? I mean, US perhaps could be different from South America, or Europe could be different compared to Africa. But the point is, are you constructing an argument for the UN, in a sense, or for the Human Declaration, or you are constructing an argument for national legislation?
Oh, that's an important question. My concern here is to talk about how human dignity is being considered as constitutional law in Brazil. And of course, I'm not saying that it's disputable. I think this is the way that the majority of the literature and jurisprudence are considering human dignity as being a value, of course, not only a legal value, but a legal value as well, and a principle and a rule. And in this case, as a principle and a rule, the law is, of course, related to fundamental rights in different ways. I know exactly that we have discussion even in Germany trying to, apart from this tendency of the Federal Constitutional Court to consider human dignity as a right, as itself as a fundamental right. Now we have people saying differently, say that it's the ground for other rights, like, not exactly this way, Christoph Enders, not the constitutional law. Say, okay, we must come back to human dignity not being a fundamental right as such, as itself, but because that's the only way to consider human dignity as an absolute value principle. Because if it's related to fundamental rights, and it's fundamental right, we can also, we can always say that the right is limited, so we can, of course, start limiting human dignity as well. I'm trying to say this in English, not the best way. What I'm saying is, the approach here is how human dignity is being treated in the Brazilian constitutional legal order as a value, as a principle, and as a rule, and a fundamental right. Of course, we're not saying in Brazil that we have a right to dignity. What we have is, like in Germany, but not written in the Constitution, a right to protect and to, of course, educate respect for our dignity. Now, no one says in Brazil seriously that we have a right to dignity as such. But we have a right to have our dignity being protected and even promoted as a positive right, social right, for instance, in our Constitution and through our jurisprudence. If it's wrong or not, of course, it's also controversial in Brazil. We have resistance against certain usage of human dignity, that's clear. I'm saying what is doing dignity. And in this sense, we are closer to the Federal Constitutional Court of Germany than to other traditions in the last 30 years since having enacted our current constitution. But we know that in Germany it's also very disputed how the courts, federal court and other courts, behave with human dignity. And we can have many examples in this sense. So that's also an approach, and of course not excluding all the controversy you have now mentioned during the question.
We have a last question.
In Germany, and I know that it's a controversial issue, but there was a good there was a good book by PUCRS. You may know the book about mentioned word by PUCRS at Moore-Siebeck. So, in my view, it convincingly shows that it is, on the one hand, what you mentioned, it is in the current fundamental law, what is protected by all human rights, but on the other hand, in some, not very numerous cases, in very few cases, it is also directly applied, for instance, in the case of the 12th page. So as a human right in itself. My question is whether one may consider, I'm inclined to do so, that when human dignity in the German fundamental law is directly applied as a human right, whether it is, in my view, it is more a kind of provisionary measure in the expectation of defining more precisely a human right. I believe the list of the human right is not closed. It's open, as many others say. And considering dignity, I'd like to know why. I observe that you mentioned the decisions of the US Supreme Court, all the references to human dignity in relation to punishment are from the last 2 decades, to my knowledge. The very last time, the last decade.
30 years.
30 years. But it was not original, exactly, and you mentioned first in the 20th century. Why did it change? Because you could apply directly, you could say that's only the 8th Amendment, period. But the vocabulary changed all over the world. Why is the reason why we need the vocabulary of human dignity instead of just applying that, which was, for instance, in Beccaria, not explicitly related to human dignity, and it was the source of the US 8th Amendment.
I think it was taken Professor Parker into consideration in the question. I know the work from Niels Steiger.
Switch on the mic.
I know the book from Niels Steiger, what was very new, and this of course an Alexis chicken, which we wrote, allow me to say this, and then he followed of course strictly Alexis' approach, and try to dismute, try how the Federal Court in Germany say this in absolute value principle, but in fact not. The practice not. I would say the reading the Supreme Court, now go to Supreme Court in the US, of course they have the usual cruel punishment prohibition clause that is really applied in these cases. But they use human dignity even as a way to enforce, to reinforce maybe, to give more power to the argument to fulfill this clause of unusual, saying unusual and cruel punishment is the cruel punishment which violates human dignity. That's the way. And we have, of course, in state constitutional law in the US, some constitutions they have human dignity in its text. Not on the federal level. And of course, since the constitution in the US is a much opener, only couple of constitutional rights, general clauses are used as a way to justify not only the application of other fundamental rights, constitutional rights, but also to create other rights. Like the privacy clause, it's also not written in the Constitution. The autonomy principle. So they are using human dignity in several decisions in this way, as a way to interpret and to reinforce maybe other constitutional rights. I would give another example. The due process of law as a material, substantive process of due process of law. Not a formal one. Say, you can take the life, you can take the life, the property, the liberty from one person if you do it so the right way. In fact, who says this? First Amendment. No one can take your life and your dignity, and your life and your property and your liberty. Although it's done by the right way. The right way is the due process of law. So then you can say, the formal due process of law can do everything with the right. It only needs to be a formal due process of law, the way the law says it must be. So the human dignity is also equal protection, but human dignity became also a way to interpret what is the substantive due process of law. To kill someone or not to kill, the way to kill someone or not to kill, etc., etc. Even anti-discrimination law, like in Brazil. But in Brazil we have this in the Constitution. We have strict rules, much more strict rules than in the US, in Germany. So this is the way it is behaving. In the last 30, 40 years, because the decision about hanging is from the beginning of the 90s. It's almost more than 20 years ago. But another way. We use this, but of course on another context. In Brazil, what is it? It's not clear. Our federal Supreme Court use dignity in different ways. I think the material approach is based on many different traditions and different ways to dimension of dignity in a material sense. And of course, the disputations in absolute or not absolute is also in our court, but in the majority of cases, even not mentioned. They say it's absolute in certain contexts, but they don't say this and don't talk about other decisions. So I say the literature says it's the majority, now recognizing this, the court, in fact, the practice is this. What they say in their reasoning is not always this, and sometimes they say nothing about. So that's also a problem. The way the court justifies decisions based on human dignity is sometimes miserable and misleading, and very misleading. So that's maybe the but I don't understood well your question. So,
Well, thanks again.